Beyond the Bandlewood has an official release date of August 25th, which is right around the corner. That is just the middle of next week. Today, Riot revealed some additional cards from the upcoming expansion, including the champion Nami. All of the cards revealed are from the Bilgewater region, but the reason that I am excited for this round of reveals is that Nami and her supporting cards are a bit more general. Traditionally, in the past, a lot of the Bilgewater champions have been forced into an archetype. We think about champions like Nautilus or champions like Pike, where they kind of play themselves in deep or play themselves in lurk, and then you don't really get the opportunity to play them in any other deck. Well, Nami is a bit more general, a bit less specific, but I think that is to her benefit. So without further ado, let's dive right in and start talking about Nami. Nami is a 3-cost 2/3. She is in the Bilgewater region, as I said before. She has the attune keyword, which is important because she is spell centric. She also says, when you cast a spell, grant +1/+0 to the weakest other ally that isn't immobile. Now, the reason they added this context here with the immobile part is because they don't want you to be granting this buff to kegs, for example. If you're playing her in the Bilgewater region, you might also be including kegs, and we don't want her buff, her bonus, to be granted to kegs. That just doesn't make sense. We also want her to avoid cards like Monkey Idol, for example, as well. So we level Nami up when we have gained 7 or more spell mana throughout the course of a game. We get credit towards this from her attune keyword, but we get it as well from all of the other ways that we would gain spell mana. When she does level up, she gets that standard +1/+1 to her base stats, so she becomes a 3-cost 3/4 with attune. But we also get a +1/+1 to her effect. And so what that means is when you cast a spell, you grant +2/+1 to your weakest ally. And that's honestly a really big bonus when you factor in the number of cheap spells a lot of regions have access to. We have gems and Targon, for example, which is a lot of potential buffs, right? We have the +1 from the gem, and then we get the +2/+1 from the Nami, and that's just for 1 mana for a card that's pretty easy to generate within the Targon region. And that's just Targon. We can again go to Piltover and Zaun, where we have some cheap spells, and we could potentially buff like Teemo or some of those other cheaper units. We have Fizz right in the region with Bilgewater. We have Elusives and Ionia, and so on and so forth. And so what I like about Nami, as I said before, is that unlike other Bilgewater champions, she's kind of purposefully general, and we have the opportunity to see her played in a number of different archetypes. Now, her champion spell is Nami's Ebb. Again, there is a regular version of Ebb, and so I'm actually just going to jump to the next screen to talk about it because Ebb is really interesting. It's very much like her spell if you've ever played League of Legends, where it's going to bounce around, and we're going to get that but in spell form here. So Ebb is a 2-cost fast spell that deals 2 randomly to an enemy or the enemy nexus, but when that happens, you also then create a flow in hand. So you spend 2 to deal 2, but you don't get to choose the targets. It's at random. So that's the one downside, but you get to create a flow. Flow is a 2-cost burst spell. It does have fleeting, so you're going to have to use it when you create it, but when you play flow, you get to heal an ally or your nexus for 2, and then you create an ebb and flow in hand. Ebb and flow is a 2-cost fast spell with fleeting, so again, you would have to use it the turn you create it, but this deals 2 randomly to an enemy or the nexus and also does the healing as well. And so what you end up with Ebb is the opportunity to spend a total of 6 mana to deal 4, heal 4, and you'll get 3 spell triggers in total, which is really, really cool when you think about it, because you've got all those different layers of flexibility in between. You don't have to play all 3, or you can choose to play all 3, or you can kind of fake it and play mind games, right? Like you could play the Ebb, and if you've got a bunch of spell mana, you could set up a moment where your opponent might think you're going to play the rest of the chain, and then you go and you do something else. You go off script, if you will. And so I really like what this brings to the table, both from a flexibility standpoint, but also kind of like a mind game standpoint. And I'm looking forward to seeing whether or not this is good enough to run in the main deck with a Nami build. The one thing that I think is hurting it is the randomization. But if we're playing Bilgewater, we're kind of already used to that when we factor in things like Make It Rain. And we could also see this become really powerful with kegs and things like that as well. Now, one card that wants to see us play a lot of spells and would potentially love for us to play all 3 pieces of the ebb and flow chain is the other card that's on the screen. This is Abyssal Guard. It's got fantastic art, so let's just start by saying that. This is a 4-cost 2/3 fearsome, and if you only saw those parts, you would say, hey, why am I spending 4 mana for a 2/3? That sounds awful. But it also says, when you cast a spell, give me +2/+0 this round, which is technically a lot when you factor in something even just as silly as gems. We're going to go back to that target example. If you've played Mentor of Stones and it has died, and now you're playing those 3 gems on this Abyssal Guard, well, suddenly you're swinging for 11 in that scenario, and you're doing it with fearsome, which is kind of scary, especially if they don't have a way to block the fearsome. I think what's ultimately going to decide whether this sees competitive play or not will be how often you feel like you can connect with the Nexus specifically, because we don't have Overwhelm on this, and while it does have fearsome, there are still plenty of ways to stop that, interact with it, etc. We are also going to be worried about silence effects, and I know that Mini-Morph is also on people's minds, so I don't know whether or not this will end up making the cut, but I do think that it's going to be good enough at a minimum to warrant testing and to maybe play for memes every now and then, because I just want to catch somebody off guard. I want to have what appears to be a very benign 2/3 that is suddenly swinging for, you know, 11 or 13 or just something absolutely obnoxious. So I do really like this card. I also like that you can kind of set that up as well, where if you also have Nami on the board, then your buffs go even greater. If you just have Nami and Abyssal Guard and then those 3 gems, well, ho ho ho, now you're pushing a ridiculous amount of damage. And so, like I said, even if it's not competitive, I feel like there's going to be some sort of fun meme with that, and I'm excited to try it out. But that's it for this particular screen, so we're going to move on and talk about the next round of reveals. First up on this screen, we have one of the most unique cards in Legends of Runeterra history. I do not think that is hyperbole. I think this card really truly is unique. So I want to explain the card first, and by that I mean what it does, and then I want to talk about potential uses. The card is Avatar of the Tides. This is a 6-cost 4/5 without any keywords, without any special tags. It's just a 6-cost 4/5. But it says, if you would get a mana gem, instead refill your spell mana. When you cast a spell, create in hand a random spell that costs 3 or less and give it fleeting. We cast a spell, we get another spell. We cast a spell, we get another spell. And we rinse and we repeat. And so when you have somebody like Nami on the board, where you might not necessarily even care about the quality of the spells you're playing, you're just caring about the quantity, this gives us access to the ability to just never run out. If we don't want to run out, we can just make a new spell when we play the other spell. And because this is 3 or less, we have the opportunity to create some 1-cost spells or even some 0-cost spells, which would allow us to keep that spell train running. So when you look at that, you're thinking, okay, well, this is actually a pretty cool effect. I can understand why we only get a 4/5 for 6. But what also intrigues me is the first part of the card, where if you would get a mana gem, instead you refill your spell mana. So you want to play this before you've hit mana 10, because you'll always be getting that full refill. But also you want to play it before you hit mana 10, because this is something that purposefully keeps you below your opponent for mana gems. And that calls to mind the mini Shurima package, where you've got a spell that does something, but it does something significantly more powerful when you have less mana gems than your opponent. And in the past, we had to kind of self-destroy our mana gems. And when you hit long games where you would hit 10 mana, well, then you'd have to self-destroy and then play your cards for the payoff. And so we never really saw those explored. This gives us an opportunity to further explore that archetype. Now, I'm not convinced there is enough there to warrant this becoming competitive yet, but this is access to something that we did not have in the past. And if we get more Shurima cards in the future that further feed that archetype, we could see this become a staple in the future. So we absolutely want to earmark it for that as a potential possibility. And we also want to consider it for Nami decks. Specifically, if you're playing the kind of Nami deck where you have a bunch of kind of cheap, maybe elusive followers and units, and you're relying on Nami to buff them up, and you just want a large number of very cheap spells, well, you might not ever care about hitting 10 mana when you can just keep refilling your spell mana and emptying it, in which case this kind of a card would actually be, I think, a net benefit. But it's going to warrant some testing, and I don't know if it's going to be better than just running other draw cards because we are talking about random spells, but I could see the appeal there. And when we start talking about like Burblefish decks where you just want a bunch of spells as well, Fizz where you want access to spells and so on and so forth, I could see this used in some of those decks, but we'll have to wait and see. Speaking of the sea, we've got a cute, adorable little follower that we're going to talk about next. This is Fleet Admiral Shelley, a sea turtle riding what I assume is the Falcor of the ocean. But anyway, Fleet Admiral Shelley is a 5-cost 3/3, but it does have the elusive keyword and the attune keyword, and it also says for every 2 spells that you play in a round, you grant other allies +1/+1. And so when you're talking about Nami and buffing small units and potentially the go wide strategy, and then you're also adding in that Avatar of the Tides where you might just be playing an endless string of spells, or near endless anyway, Fleet Admiral Shelley feels like the kind of card you would want to fit into that archetype, because now you are getting the Nami effect, but then you're also kind of getting this board wide buff as well, and you're doing that on an elusive body on top of it. So Fleet Admiral Shelley, I do think will find a home in Bilgewater elusive centric decks. The question will be whether or not those decks are good enough to unseat the existing elusive decks. And I think that we're not going to know that until we have the opportunity to test them. But this card at least wins on a cuteness scale. It's 10 out of 10. And if you have not seen the flavor text for this card, I won't spoil it, but just go ahead and look it up. And I think that you might get a nice chuckle out of it. We're going to move on though, and we're going to talk about Journeying Sandhopper. This is very simple. It is a 3-cost 4/3 attune, and that's it. No other keywords, no other text, no other unit tags. It's just a 3-cost 4/3 attune. And while it's very generic, I could see a world where this sees play. If you're playing a slower control deck, especially one that is spell centric, giving yourself access to a unit that trades very well at 3 mana with the 4 attack, it could trade up very nicely. And giving yourself access to some additional spell mana, I could see the appeal of this. Whether or not this makes the cut, I think will depend on the deck that you're playing, but I like this card for a nice, simple filler card, and sometimes you need those when you're building decks. Now, a card that I think will absolutely find a home, however, is the Mirai Songstress. This is a 2-cost 3/2, but it says when I'm summoned, if you've cast a spell this round, grant me elusive. Now, when I first saw this card, I immediately thought about Otterpuss. Otterpuss is the 1-drop that has a tune, but also creates the prank in hand. And so when you're talking about openers, if you go round 1 Otterpuss, and then you bank your attuned spell mana, and now you're going round 2, you use that spell mana to play your prank, and then you play Songstress, well, you're getting a 3/2 with elusive after you have pranked, which I think is a very strong tempo opener depending on what you hit with the prank. So again, we won't know how good prank really is until we see all of the options and all of the disruption possibilities, but I do think there is a world where this sees play because of that potential opener, and we're just going to have to wait and see exactly how powerful that ends up being. The last card on this particular graphic is the Mirai Warden. This is a 2-cost 2/1, and it very simply reads, when I'm summoned, you summon a random 1-cost follower. This is, I think, great support for Bilgewater. We've already seen a number of units that interact with 1-cost cards, whether it is the spells like Jailbreak that make them, or we have the Officer. Obviously, we have Jagged Taskmaster that's buffing the cards that cost 1. Overall, I just like that we're getting another tool for that archetype. It hasn't particularly been a very powerful archetype to date, but I like that they are still supporting some of these older archetypes, and maybe one day we will see that archetype get the actual time that it deserves in the spotlight. I just don't think that this card is going to be the card that pushes it over the edge. And so we're going to move on to the final graphic, and we're going to talk about these 2 cards. Now, I know you see 4, but it's really 2 cards here. The first one is Mirai Great Mother. This is a 4-cost 3/3, but it says when I'm summoned, create 5 random 6 or more cost spells in your deck and lower their cost to 3. Now, we're all probably salivating as we think about the high roll potential of this card. I know myself, I was daydreaming about surprising my opponent with a 3-cost Judgment, or clearing the board with a 3-cost Ruination, or drawing a bunch of cards with a 3-cost Progress Day, and heavens forbid we get the 3-cost The Skies Descend. But what we have to remember is for all of those high rolls, there are some pretty bad or just not very good 6-cost spells. So for example, we could run into something like Illegal Contraption, which, you know, you could say, okay, well, you're still getting a 5/5 for 3 and that's not bad, but the reality is at some stages of the game that also just might not be good enough, and we could have just drawn something better from our deck. And since we have no control over what this is creating, and then when we do play this, we don't get the immediate benefit, we do still have to draw the cards we have created, we could end up in many games just spending 4 mana for a generic 3/3. And so we have to factor that in as well. But obviously the high roll potential will create some highlight reels over time. When you talk about Great Mother, I think you have to mention Zap Sprayfin in the same breath, because that's going to be your most consistent way to create something potentially absurd and then draw it. Now, whether or not you are running these two together with no other cheap spells, so Zap is specifically a tutor for what she creates, or whether or not you're just playing this alongside your other traditional package, we'll have to wait and see, but that is something that we want to consider. And Zap is another card that we want to consider when we talk about the last card that was revealed, and that was Tidal Wave. So Tidal Wave is a 3-cost slow spell, and it says deal 1 to 2 different randomly targeted enemies and create Crashing Wave in your deck. Crashing Wave is a 3-cost slow spell that says deal 2 to 4 different randomly targeted enemies and create Colossal Wave in your deck. And then Colossal Wave says deal 4 to all enemies and the enemy nexus. So this ends up being like the Bilgewater version of Go Hard, which is kind of funny because oftentimes Go Hard is played with Bilgewater anyway. And so we could see a world where maybe you play the two together, or maybe you only focus on Tidal Wave because we can fetch all versions of this with Zap. Whereas after the Pack Your Bags nerf, we cannot fetch Pack Your Bags with Zap. And we have this option now. Whether or not this overtakes Go Hard, I don't know. We are paying more for this every time, where Go Hard was a pretty low investment. We could just spend 1 to get credit towards it. We also had Go Hard protecting us from decking ourselves, for example, which was kind of a nice to have. So we'll have to wait and see, but I just like that they're kind of exploring that archetype for other regions, because that's exactly what this is. Let's be honest, this is the Go Hard archetype, but just implemented differently. And I love it thematically. I like that the art scales, and I like that it keeps scaling up as well. What I don't like, though, is that it's not affecting all copies. So when you play the first Tidal Wave, yes, you create a Colossal Wave in your deck, but you also could just turn around and play your Zap and get one of your other Tidal Waves. And so we don't get the guaranteed progression of our waves, and I think that's potentially the biggest detriment here. On that note, we have reached the end of the Nami related reveals. I want to hear from you. What cards are you excited about playing with? What kind of decks do you want to build Nami in? As I said before, I'm really excited that she's a bit more generic. We traditionally end up with Bilgewater champions that are kind of forced into an archetype. And I think Bilgewater is a very interesting and unique region. And so having access to champions where we can put them into a bunch of different decks is just really appealing to me. So I want to know how you're going to use Nami. If you made it this far, as always, I appreciate you. Thank you for watching. And until next time, may you walk on warm sands.